When you ask about feeling irritable and getting angry, it sounds so legitimate. It sounds so much as though this is me. I am prone to being irritable and being critical and then getting angry with people, and specifically in relation to people. And it feels so legitimate. It's not who you are. It is not what you are. But what has happened is over time during our life, awareness, our consciousness has become so entrenched in this aspect of our psychology and our physiology. And this is not true for everyone because, in fact, we could say that on the one end of the spectrum, anger is exactly the same as shyness on the other end of the spectrum. That they are really the same because they share in common a key element. And that key element is this feeling of I. And in the case of irritability, for example, some people have a tendency, they're just very easily irritated. And particularly, it can happen, they're very easily irritated about other people. And this can start to boil, it can start to become criticism and then active accusation and blame, and they belittle people and they talk negatively about other people to other people. And then, of course, it can reach its extreme where it becomes full-fledged anger, which can be very destructive. Because anger, as you know, can have a psychological as well as a physical component, and both can be highly destructive. What has led to this is how awareness has become infused in the mind, in the body, or as the fourth way says, in the four centers. Some people who are more naturally active are prone to this, and awareness becomes infused in them. It gets mixed up, entwined with their centers, and it forms itself in the shape of the ego. And now it feels like I, and it feels like I am an irritable person. I get angry, I get upset. This is my nature, this is who I am. And in a way, it's not true. It's simply that this energy that is the result of awareness identifying, meaning it becomes attached to the centers. And then it identifies. It now not just attaches, it forms as a sense of identity. And that's what the ego is. The ego is not a separate thing. It's a manifestation of awareness, attaching and then identifying with and forming itself around our psychology and our physiology and our behavior as a feeling of I. When this happens in people who are more active, this manifestation of energy in the form of irritability and criticism and blame and anger, it's all like an attack. It's an outward version, an outward self-display of the ego in the form of aggression and attack. On the other end of the spectrum is where people who are more passive types are prone to form their ego. And in this case, awareness wraps itself around, it gets entwined in and confused with a feeling of I in the passive side of our nature. So this is a person who, instead of becoming irritable, they pull back, they withdraw, they become recalcitrant, they become stubborn, they feel self-pity, they feel guilt. They then isolate themselves, and this can lead to depression instead of anger. And they feel shy instead of bold. Instead of feeling emboldened like someone who's angry, who has anger and who attacks, a person with this more passive nature doesn't feel emboldened at all. They feel fearful, they feel shy. They withdraw into themselves, and instead of the ego manifesting as an outward display of this power and anger and irritation and attack, the ego now withdraws into self-isolation inwardly. It insulates itself as a feeling of I. But just as on the other end of the spectrum with irritability and criticism and belittling other people and anger, on this passive side of the spectrum, there's also a physiological and a psychological component. So a person can psychologically feel guilt and self-pity, and they can get to the point where they're depressed, and then they can get to the point too where they do physical harm to themselves. In this sense, it's really exactly the same thing, the anger and the depression, the shyness and the attacking. They're really the same thing. They are different manifestations of the same thing, you could say. And the key element they share in common is this central feeling of I. In a way, you could say it can be an advantage if you are more extreme in this regard, because then it's so much more obvious for you to observe in yourself and see. And when I say the spectrum, by the way, I'm not talking about modern day psychology and the idea of being on the spectrum. I'm using this as an example for comparison. But not everyone has these things so extreme. Many people are closer to the middle, sort of in between somewhere. They seem quote unquote normal. However, what happens is, as soon as the pressure turns up, is ratcheted up in their life, as soon as their ego is threatened or attacked or challenged, or as soon as life circumstances start to press on them a little bit, they will tend to one or other of these two ends, these two directions. Some people, as soon as they're under pressure or under attack by others, immediately you will see, sometimes surprisingly so, they become very accusatory and very defensive and very angry. And it can be startling, and they'll become nasty and mean, and you wonder who that is all of a sudden, because normally they're not acting like that, and they don't think of themselves that way. But it's there, right beneath the surface, waiting, in the case of anger, for example, to explode, or as irritation to kind of just drip out, as this negative irritation, this being displeased, finding fault all the time, and even being sort of quietly pissed off all the time, just below the surface. Anything will get them going, but you don't see it until they're under pressure. Likewise, someone who tends to be more passive and tends more toward, let's say, shyness or being more prone to self-pity, a little bit of guilt, can easily become depressed. They are more in the middle until, again, the pressure is turned up, or until something challenges them or threatens them, until their little bear is poked. And when that happens, instead of going on the attack externally in violent measure, they pull back. They become quiet, they insulate, they turn inward, they shut off, and they shut down. And again, they may not appear to be this way all the time, but as soon as a certain pressure happens in relation to their ego or in relation to their body, their health, their wealth, their finances, their relationships, this kind of thing, until that happens, you don't see the extreme to which they will go. And in this case, it's a more passive extreme. It's in the direction of shyness and stubbornness and recalcitrance and self-pity and depression. All these examples share in common the key element of this feeling of I. And the origin of this feeling of I is awareness. It's consciousness. But what has happened and what happens is awareness immediately identifies with what's going on in our mind and body, and given the natural construction of our body and mind, of our psyche and our physiology, awareness attaches to that. It gets infused, it gets entangled, and it becomes this feeling of I. But what's interesting, if you took two people, one is more aggressive and angry and attacking and prone to that type of psychology and that type of behavior in relation to people especially, and you take, on the other hand, someone who's quiet and shy, who withdraws quickly, isolates themselves, could easily perhaps do self-harm. If you took both of those people, and if you could somehow extract the awareness out of their idea of themselves as a person, that extraction would be exactly the same. The pure awareness, the realization of being, the recognition by awareness of itself as itself would be exactly the same. One of the things that happens is we will often ask a question about something like this. We want to cure our anger. We want to resolve it. We want to cure our depression. We want to resolve it. And we ask the question, and without realizing, we are entrenched in it already. We are entrenched in the feeling of I behind that. And we end up then wanting to solve that problem from inside this feeling of I am irritated. I am feeling stubborn. I am withholding. Or I am attacking. When in fact, there is no solution to this psychologically. However, there is a resolution, and the resolution is this extraction of awareness. Awareness realizing itself. And how it does this is you can see that you are being irritable. You can see that you are becoming stubborn. You can see that you're going on the attack. You can see that you're withdrawing. You can see that you become violently angry. You can see that you become stubbornly recalcitrant and even depressed and feeling sorry for yourself. Something can see all this, and that which is seeing all this can realize itself, and by virtue of realizing itself, extract itself from this feeling of I. And when the feeling of I begins to dissipate, because it has no more this concentrated energy of awareness attached to it, the rest of all this falls away, begins to fall away. And for many people it is a gradual. Someone who is shy realizes over time, wait a minute, that's just an imaginary idea of myself. I've been imagining myself as a shy person. Or someone who's angry, I've been imagining myself as this emboldened, powerful person who can get things that he or she wants by virtue of being angry. I can push people around and realize that's just the imaginary picture I have of myself. In fact, there's a wonderful depiction of this in the Gospels, in the New Testament, of Paul, who was Saul, who was on the attack, who was angry, who was bitter, who was doing physical harm as a result of his imagining himself a certain way. And this idea of the conversion of Saul is what we're talking about. You could say that there was a realization that his awareness had, and he fell off of his horse. He literally fell off of his emotional center, off of his emotional infatuation with, identification with himself as a type of person who in that case was attacking the Christians. Of course, that's the religious story, but the inner meaning of it is just what we're talking about, a transformation that's brought about by transcending this feeling of I in the human makeup. But this is a big step. This is what's so difficult for many people to arrive at, because we're entrenched in the feeling of I and don't want to let go. It feels so secure. And we don't even know we're holding on to it so tightly. We don't even know that we are really this awareness that has become infused in and confused with this feeling of being this person.